Hello and welcome to Monocle on Culture. I'm Robert Bound. On today's show, we're heading to the hustle, bustle and bright lights of the Big Apple. New York is the backdrop for two new cultural gems, a documentary set in the city's buzzy, punky, grimy 1970s when John Lennon and Yoko Ono were roaming Greenwich Village, pursuing art projects, preparing for a charity concert and hanging out with the leftist radicals so symbolic of the age. The film is also about them at home, revelling in the newfound 24/7ness of TV with its own bright lights and billboards, ready to dance in front of your eyes and suck you in with its own version of the gleaming American dream. Then we'll fast forward and hear about a contemporary novel set in New York City. Katie Kitamura's Audition follows an actor and her unsettling encounter with someone who claims to be her son. It's an enticing premise by one of America's most loved authors, one that interrogates the notion of performance and asks to what extent we're all performing our own lives. From rock and roll then to the existential, it could only be New York City. You might think you've seen, read and listened to everything about the Beatles, or even vaguely Beatle tangential. Aside from Ian Leslie's superb new book about the deep friendship between John and Paul, a new film also proves that stories about the band and its associates can still surprise and captivate. One-to-One, John and Yoko is a new documentary using restored footage and unseen material, including some very funny telephone calls about trying to buy thousands of flies for an art installation, to tell a story about John Lennon and Yoko Ono that's rarely given airtime. At the heart of it is the One-to-One benefit concert held by the duo in New York in 1972, but the film really tells a much deeper story about the couple, about New York as a city and a character in itself, and of course the mad, bad and rollicking 1970s. It's directed by Kevin Macdonald and co-directed and edited by Sam Rice Edwards, with whom I met at Midori House last week. Sam, congratulations on a really wonderful film, One-to-One, John and Yoko, co-directed by yourself and Kevin Macdonald. I watched it again this morning. As we said before we switched on the mics, it was a wonderful thing to see a screening on the big screen with great speakers, all the rest of it. It ranks on the small screen too. I want to know, first of all, how you as a director and as an editor, how you get under the skin of that thing, how you get the energy of those live performances of New York in that era and indeed of those two great creative minds onto the screen, how you capture that fizzle and dazzle.
Well, thanks very much for the intro, and I'm really, really happy that you enjoyed the film. And I'll start with the concert. That was very badly filmed, actually, and it forced us into something where we actually didn't cut very much, and we had very long shots during the sequences of the concert. And a lot of close-ups to really kind of focus in on John or Yoko, and so we could see their emotion on screen. And that way we felt, you know, we could watch the concert and enjoy the concert, but really kind of get to know them at the same time. Yeah, I mean, I think it also gave a slight feeling of being at a concert as well, those sequences, because, often this isn't a concert film, but in concert films, there's a lot of cutting and a lot of cuts, and actually that doesn't really feel like being at a concert, whereas here we have long shots and we're kind of really focusing on John or Yoko. So I think that gives the feeling of being there and sort of brings a certain energy.
Yeah, it does. I mean, as I say, it really crackles off the screen. I mean, both John and Yoko are at a very interesting point in their creative lives. John busting out of the barroom brawl that the Beatles became, I suppose, into the sort of mad energy of New York. And he and Yoko live in a 2-bedroom apartment in Greenwich Village, down the road, I think, from Jerry Rubin, who plays quite a large role in the film, who's the kind of radical activist of the time. He kind of become a countercultural American icon, I suppose. That's often written about, but it's rarely seen, I suppose. That must have been interesting footage to be playing with.
The whole kind of thing started with the concert footage and Kevin being approached to make this film, but really it was very wide open as to what the film could be, and we sat around kind of scratching our heads for a while and sort of feeling our way forward, and it started to become clear that really this moment from late 71 to the beginning of 73 was a kind of really special moment in their life that was very different from other times and hadn't been covered that much, as you say, in film. And I think, you can sort of sum it up in the way of the fact that two of the most well-known people in the world moved to New York to escape sort of England and the Beatles and all the furore around that, and they moved into essentially a studio apartment the door opened onto the street, and that would just never happen now. It very rarely would happen then.
Go wrong?
Exactly. So we kind of felt that this really was a kind of defined time in their lives, and that is why some elements of the only shot element of the film is the reconstruction of their apartment, which we felt was the kind of spatial core of the film, the sort of geographical core of the film. It was an important element in the film.
Yeah, it certainly is. I'd like to talk about how you did the reconstruction. As you say, it's kind of quite central to the film because it's the one shot bit. It's the one thing that you can control ultimately, I suppose, as filmmakers. And you've got different storytelling devices in the film. There's obviously the concert footage itself and the sort of on-stage, off-stage business of that. I mean, Lennon, I think, said that he and Yoko just got this apartment and spent the first year in America watching the TV.
Yeah.
I mean, he possibly with tongue-in-cheek, but you kind of dive into that. And a lot of your narrative device is news footage. It's obviously the civil rights was first and foremost, the Attica prison riot and how that was suppressed, and obviously the Vietnam War, and then the protest movement more generally happening. So there's a lot of stuff bubbling in the great cauldron of culture and the counterculture. So let's talk about the archive. Where do you go first? Were you offered a kind of great wealth to dig into, a kind of treasure trove of stuff?
Just to sort of lead into that on the TV, I mean, it's not... Yeah, I know it's sort of... He was slightly joking in that bit in the film, but they did actually sit around watching TV a lot.
Yeah.
And they were sort of obsessed by television. And what we were trying to do in the film really is to create the feeling that they had, like a time capsule.
Channel hop like they would have been doing.
Exactly.
Seeing the same adverts, the same newscasters.
Exactly. So the viewer, hopefully, when they see the film, they can see the world, what the world looked like through the eyes of John and Yoko at that time.
I mean, I love that as a device. It's great. And it's fascinating in its own right, but it's, as you say, fascinating to see what they would have been seeing.
Exactly. And we kind of thought that it's a way of actually kind of getting closer to their experience, and instead of forcing a narrative on the film, we could let that play out and let the viewer really kind of experience that time for themselves and sort of travel with John and Yoko through 1972. But in terms of the archive, it's like, I mean, I'm sort of laughing because it was, it's just, we went through so much. It was I've
got visions
insane...
of Sam, of you kind of coming out of an attic covered in cobweb with a big grin on your face, but also with a huge job of work to do.
Yeah. No, I mean, there were definitely times like that. I mean, the thing is, the footage of John and Yoko in 1972 is a kind of relatively finite thing. You can get through it. There's a lot of stuff, and the Lennon estate were really great in sort of opening up their archives to us. But there's also everything else in 1972 that you could have seen on television, and that sort of feels almost infinite. So we were searching through all sorts of things, whether it be archives all over the States, public television archives or private collections, but also the internet as well. It's an amazing source. And so via all these things, we sort of periodically found treasure troves.
And I would guess, Sam, I know for myself, I'd guess it's the same for you. We are both fortunate and unfortunate enough not to have seen and witnessed the energy of New York City in the early 1970s firsthand.
You're very kind to me. Yeah.
But nonetheless, I think the film that you and Kevin have made has got such aliveness to it. I do feel like you've parachuted us in behind the front lines of rock and roll stardom, of countercultural things, and behind news stories and behind the making of what also became the Sometime in New York LP, right, as well. I feel like you've done an amazing job of capturing that liveness. What were the conversations that you and Kevin had, if indeed you did have them, in order to kind of keep that balloon in the air, I wonder? Yeah,
I mean, we definitely had those conversations all the time, and Kevin came up with this wonderful quote that I remembered that he said one day. He said, in film, the only crime is to bore. I think that's a really kind of central pillar of doing something like this, and Kevin's kind of, what I've learned from him is really to sort of feel your way forward, so don't try and force anything onto the material, let the material tell you what it needs to be. And so, we were looking through sort of reams and reams of archive, and really we would just pick things that felt like for some reason they were saying something, but it didn't really matter what they were saying. And so, gradually we built up this kind of bank of stuff that was, interesting moments, but often we weren't quite sure why exactly they were interesting.
Yeah.
And the things, these would get cold all the time. So the things that you see in the film are ultimately the things that have survived.
Kept you going as articles, yeah.
Exactly, survived this filtration process. So, through that, I think we found moments that are very telling of the time and have a certain energy, and without trying to force it on, from our point of view, we weren't there. We weren't, as you say, in New York in 1970, but we could still follow the material and see, okay, this feels like it's saying something important, and we're going to put it in.
I mean, there's a mirror in a way, and I think that's why it suits the subject of the film so well, and the way you've told the story, the way you use archive and news footage. And then you're talking about, especially with John Lennon, I think, at that point. I mean, he's such a magpie for new stuff that wasn't him being in his old band, I guess. And that's there seems to be a lot of openness to new ideas, a lot of him being egged on by people that could certainly use his fame and his name and his money as well. Yeah. Yoko, as an artist, was a bit more constant in the things that she made, believed in and did, it seems. I mean, I'm a fan of her work, her music and her art. But John was definitely up for kind of anything at this period, right? And I think this captures it. I mean, you guys must have talked about that as well, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's so hard to define a person, but I definitely think there's something in John where he was constantly looking, actually searching for ultimately who he was. And so, you had these different phases, and, had the Maharishi, you had primal scream therapy, so he had all these kind of different phases where he was kind of exploring who he was, and so then he lands in New York in this... And
other less kosher techniques, we might point out.
Oh, of course, yeah, no,
it wasn't all TV.
No, there's all sorts, obviously, big waves of, LSD and all of this kind of thing. But, I think in New York, both of them, I think, arrived with a feeling of freedom. They've sort of left their past behind, and they wanted to change the world. And they connected with a lot of local radicals and artists, and had a lot of big ideas, and then they kind of smashed into politics and maybe came to realize that it's harder than you think to change the world, and they sort of went back to maybe focusing on themselves and trying to improve things in smaller ways.
I mean, there's that real punk energy that comes out of both of their performances as well, which you might say Yoko carried on more than John did, actually, in the records.
Well, I mean, I think weirdly, I think Yoko isn't actually, I think she's a bit of a pioneer in terms of punk, and she's not really recognised for that. Her music is very much Marmite to a lot of people. Some people love it, some people don't. But I came to really love those pieces in there. So.
Yeah, I thought that too, and I wondered what you felt being presumably a fan of their music together, but it's such a soundtrack to that era. Like, looking back, the voices of both of them together, and especially Yoko's singing voice, is so inseparable from the early 1970s somehow. The records, the more melodic records that they made, and the more kind of fuck you records that they made, right? It seems very much, it's like the writing through the stick of rock of music at that period. I mean, it's something you've really documented there as well, I suppose.
I know exactly what you mean. That just the sound of their voices kind of takes you to that era, but as well. But I think what was really nice was sort of discovering Yoko's music through this process. Her music obviously isn't as well known, but ultimately, for me, two of them, she's actually got 2 solo songs in the film, and those I think are, if not the most emotional, certainly amongst the most emotional moments in the film. That was a side of her I didn't know, actually, before the film.
Talking of voices and honesty and really getting under the skin of things, one of the brilliant things that you and Kevin have uncovered are the phone calls, which
Yeah.
That was going to be one of the first things I asked you about. It's turned out to be one of the last.
Yeah,
anyway, which is fiendishly clever and very amusing and very revealing, in terms of a documentary facility. Where did they come from? When did you realise that you had such gold dust? And when did you decide to annotate them, I suppose, or simply put up, like the subtitles, essentially, as it were, and you fill the whole screen with subtitles? There's some of it's sad when Yoko's talking about receiving racist abuse, especially in Britain. Some of it, however, is very funny.
Yeah.
And that mostly comes from her as well, when she's ordering flies for one of her exhibits. Yeah. So tell us about that, because that talking about treasure troves, as we have done in this chat, Sam, that is brilliant.
Yeah, I mean, that was definitely a big moment. We were talking earlier, as you say, about treasure troves, and we got a call. There's someone called Simon Hilton who works at the, with the Lennon estate, and he had been over in New York and at one of their archives, and he gave us a call, and he said like, we've got this box of tapes, and I'm not quite sure, maybe they'd be of interest.
Yeah.
And
did he know what was he kind of hiding his light under a bushel?
I think he might have been. I think he might have been, because he knows that they're kind of unique.
Yeah.
So then they were sent to us, and we were immediately, we were both blown away by them, because it's so rare to hear people like that without any sense of...
They never know it's going to go down in posterity.
Exactly. Yeah. It's them being themselves, completely relaxed, away from cameras, away from the news, away from public attention, and it's very telling listening to them. So we knew straight away that they were very special. We were sort of scratching our heads how to use them, but then it sort of started to become clear that they wove in with that time. Yeah. And so we could both see what was happening at that time on screen, through archive, and hear about, what they in private, what they were thinking about those events. The idea to annotate them on screen really was that we were thinking about just having them on black, because it was just really nice listening to them. But then, we found this other ways to really just focus on the audio.
Yeah, it's done beautifully. And there's another piece of sort of audio serendipity about it, which is where people call up the obviously the one phone in their apartment, and they get John, and it's like, oh, sorry, I was hoping to speak to Yoko, and it's obviously you're speaking to John Lennon. Can you take a message for your wife? Yeah. Or else people ring up, and it's very funny. Again, listening to people have to call up and be mediated by someone before they speak to the person that they're going to speak to, which we all know. A phone number flashes up on our phones, and we know who it's going to be, and we can prepare ourselves mentally for how we tend to deal with that person, friend, foe, business associate. So there's something wonderful about that as well, which I thought was so lovely and analog, and totally, again, parachuted us behind the lines of 1971 as well. I thought it was super, super funny. I can't remember if Yoko ever got the flies. I don't think we're going to be spoiling a huge plot point.
Yeah, maybe I shouldn't. I mean, what was quite funny that people do love that strand, but sometimes people are kind of guessing what it is. One person came up to me and thought, he said for a lot of the film, he thought they were trying to score some drugs, But
right. It's a euphemism.
Actually, it was nothing to do with that at all. So and you'll have to go and see the film to see whether she got the flies.
That was Sam Rice-Edwards, and the excellent one-to-one John and Yoko is in cinemas now, and it's a truly vibrant portrait of two brilliant artists in that wonderful city. Now, the American novelist, journalist and critic Katie Kitamura received widespread acclaim for her 2021 novel Intimacies. It was longlisted for the National Book Award and the PEN Faulkner Award, and her work's been translated into 21 languages. Kitamura's fifth novel, Audition, came out on the 8th of April, and it follows a successful actor who one day meets a young man claiming to be her son. Here, she talks to Monocle contributor Naomi Shu-Elegant about her new book. Naomi began by asking her why she was drawn to a character who works as an actor.
I've always been interested in the question of performance, and it's something that I've tried to write about, I think, in the last two books in different ways. I wrote a novel called A Separation, where a woman who is separated from her husband, or rather she is separated from her husband when he disappears, and then she kind of plays the part of a kind of worried spouse and then eventually a grieving widow. And so I've always been kind of fascinated by this idea that there are parts that we play in our day-to-day lives. In my last novel, which is called Intimacies, it's set in a war crimes tribunal, and I was very, very much struck by the way that the courtroom itself kind of operated as a theater. And so I think having written those two books, I think I found myself thinking I should maybe just grab the bull by the horns and go directly into a character for whom their profession itself is acting, for whom performance is the way in which they make their living. So that's probably the reason why I chose to make her an actor. I'm also very interested in female characters in particular who are speaking the words of other people. So, you know, I've written characters who are translated. I've written a character who's an interpreter. In the case of this character, she's an actor, but she's still speaking the words that are given to her by somebody else. You know, it's very distinct in a way to the role of writer in a novel. So that kind of it felt like a gradual progression up to kind of exploring very, very directly this question of performance. And then, of course, she's somebody who's playing many, many different roles in her life and in the book as well. But, you know, and that's something that I think probably all of us can relate to. There is so much kind of, you know, sometimes you're playing a writer, sometimes you're playing a teacher, sometimes you're playing a friend, a partner, a parent, a child. You know, we negotiate all of these different roles in our day-to-day life almost without being aware of it.
As I was reading Audition, I was struck by the various mirrorings that were taking place. At one point, the protagonist describes another actor who's confused about a role he's playing, and then the play she's acting in the book, has two discrete parts with a rupture in the middle, just like the novel itself. How were you thinking about these mirrorings and layerings as you wrote?
Absolutely. I mean, I think one of the things that I really wanted to try to do in this book was write something that would contain multiple interpretations so that you could read it in many different ways. And to a certain extent, I even wanted if possible, each reader to have a slightly different experience of it. So it does contain narratives that are in some way incommensurate, you know, that can't be perfectly reconciled. Within that, I think it's a novel that's very interested in structure, and I think which is probably the least selling or appealing thing I could say, but it is a kind of novel that's interested in structure. And I think the play that's inside the play, which we never see, we never know, we don't know very, very much about it, but the one thing we do know about it is the process of writing and the structure of the play that's in the middle of the novel. And those are kind of two things that I wanted as, if not exactly keys, but as kind of parallels for the book itself. So of course the structure of the book is the same as the structure of the play. So the play isn't really in there necessarily for reasons of plot, because we don't know anything really about the plot of the play, but it's really there to kind of draw attention to the way the book is structured and how there are two halves to the book, and the character is genuinely kind of two different characters in the two halves of the book.
In this book and in your previous books, you explore moral ambiguity and play with the narrative ambiguity as well. What attracts you to ambiguity?
I mean, that is how I experience the world, I think, is the honest answer. Things very rarely seem totally clear to me. And even when they are clear to me, my mind quite quickly works to complicate matters, I think. And to some extent, particularly, I think, in my last book, I was really interested in thinking about complicity and thinking about implication and thinking about the way the central character herself is part of a larger machine, believes herself not to have any power within that machine, but then gradually comes to understand in so many ways that when you're a part of a structure of power, you are implicated in what it does. And of course, you know, I was writing that during the previous Trump administration, but I think that can be applied more broadly to what it means to be American, I think, for many, many, many years. But I think ambiguity, I think it's also to do with my own taste as a reader. I'm very rarely drawn to books where things are very, very cut and dried. I like books that are open to interpretation. I like books where there isn't an answer, but instead a kind of book that asks you to kind of inhabit this gray area. Those are the books, I would take ambiguity and discomfort over clarity and comfort any day. I think, I think in a lot of ways, the work of a book is to make the reader a little bit uncomfortable. And so I wouldn't want to write a book where I felt it was cozy. I try to write fiction that kind of presses at this question of moral ambiguity.
What was your writing process like for the book, and is it always the same? Like, do you have a daily word minimum or any rituals you follow?
At school the other day, somebody said to my daughter, something, was being very kind, and said, I'm so excited about your mom's book. And she said, my mom doesn't have a new book. And this person said, no, I'm pretty sure she does. And my daughter said, no, she definitely doesn't, because she never, ever writes. She never... She says she does everything but write. And it's true. I feel like I spend very, very little time writing. It just does not, I crave both regularity and deep immersion. And those seem to be the two things that elude me completely at the moment. So I used to be a writer who was able to say, I'd like to write 1,000 words a day. And that was how I generated a manuscript. And that has just fallen away somehow. So I must write. I do write at some point, I think, because there's a manuscript at the end of a certain number of years, but I feel like I have almost no recollection of the writing process. I will say that I do, when I can, go away to residencies and do a kind of, writing from 7 a.m. to 10 p.m, unbroken immersion into the world of the book. I'm very lucky because my partner is also a writer, and so he understands that is how the sausage gets made, so to speak. I completely understand it's not always clear that you would say to somebody, I have to leave you with the kids while I go off for 3 weeks to Switzerland to do a residency, but we swap, so he'll go, I'll go, and so that's more or less how it gets done. I think I've become very slow. I would like to be much faster. My books aren't that long. I don't think they should be taking this long to write. But sometimes I read, I've been reading a lot of Zola, or I read Balzac, and I think the speed of this production is why I think we generally in contemporary writers have become very, very slow, and I don't know why that is.
Has that changing relationship to your working schedule affected your relationship to the work itself?
I think I have such a longing to be in the world of my fiction that it's very exciting when I get time with a book. And so I have a lot of friends and incredible writers, some of the best, to me, some of the best writers working today who don't enjoy writing, who say openly that they don't like writing. I love writing. And I think that's probably because I'm not doing it very, very, very regularly, but I really love it. I just don't, I think it's almost like I don't have time to have that kind of push-pull ambivalence about my own writing. I am very, very happy when I'm sitting down with my manuscript. And in terms of how it's changed the actual relationship to the work, this book, I think I was writing it at a particularly busy time in my life for various reasons. And I think it actually did allow me to take some bigger risks with it. I think, when you're honing a manuscript every single day and you're building it piece by piece by piece, and you have this sense that you build it by accretion, it can start to feel a little bit ossified or a little bit immovable. And I think because I was writing this in shorter stretches, but very, very, like writing large pieces of the book in shorter stretches. And then, of course, there was a very regular editing process that followed after I wrote the first draft of it. But I think because I was, doing these very intense bursts on the book, it actually freed me up to take some big risks with it.
Katie Kitamura there, and that is all for this week. My thanks to Katie, Naomi Shu Elegant and Sam Rice Edwards. Monocle on Culture is produced by Sophie Monaghan-Coombs and Steph Chungu, and Steph also edits the show. We'll be back at the same time next week, but until then, from me, Robert Bound, thanks for tuning in.